Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of the Clay Christensen Institute, Michael Horn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you all. What I thought I would do today is talk about the evolving landscape of education that we see in K-12 education. And given the conference we're at with a lot of the companies we see presenting, a lot of investors thinking about how does this all come together in the future, think about how this evolution toward blended learning in the K-12 education space, what the impact might be for entrepreneurs in the future. And as you're making your decisions right now of how to shape companies and so forth. Let's see if that clicks forward. It's not clicking forward, but we'll get it in a sec. I think a lot of us have become familiar with through our work at the Clay Christensen Institute and others has been thinking about this process of disruptive innovation that takes products and services that were complicated, expensive, very inaccessible and deeply centralized and could only serve a limited few, and makes it far more, that's one more, there we go, far more accessible, convenient, simple to use and affordable such that it can serve many, many more people. And we've seen this process sweep through industry after industry after industry, from the for-profit to the not-for-profit to governmental, from highly regulated industries to unregulated ones. What's interesting about this, the chart I have up here is just simply tracing that evolution through industry after industry. So you can start there at the top and look at how disruptive innovation radically changed the automotive industry, from the American manufacturers of automobiles to the disruptive Japanese ones, and now Koreans coming up underneath them, and the Chinese and Chery coming up underneath them. You can tell the same story of disruptive innovation as we heard through e-commerce, where we saw department stores, full-service department stores that were massive and centralized, disrupted by discount retail, Walmart, Kmart, Target. Those institutions continued to improve and go up market. Target became Target, and we've seen online, we've seen online retail come up underneath them. And what's interesting, if you look around, is that who powers today Target.com? Anyone know? Amazon. Amazon powers Target.com. And so you see this evolution of disruptive innovation sweep its way through. And our observation in writing Disrupting Class in our work has been that same force of disruptive innovation that transforms sectors is sweeping through K-12 learning. And so it made us take a look at this online learning as that disruptive force and make this somewhat crazy prediction in 2008 when Disrupting Class came out, which was that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, what's interesting about that prediction is that for the first 6 months that the book was out, everyone came to us and said, you're absolutely crazy. There's no way public schools could possibly change that fast. And then about 6 months in, people came back to us and said, we still think you're crazy, but now it's because we think that you're too conservative with that prediction, that change is actually happening much faster in the world. Now, I sort of plead the fifth for a variety of reasons, but we can get into those maybe in the Q&A period. But the interesting thing is that the majority of this online learning growth has been in blended learning environments. And it's our observation that 90% plus of the online learning that grows in the K-12 education environment is going to be in blended learning. And so it led us to do a lot of research over the last several years at the Institute, trying to figure out what exactly was blended learning and actually bring a definition, a common way to talk about it among the field. And so our definition at the moment has 3 parts. The first is that it's any time in a formal education that a student's learning, at least in part through online learning, where they have some element of student control over the time, the place, the path, and/or the pace of learning. It's at least in part in a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home, so generally a school with a teacher. And the third part, which is something we're introducing in a paper that comes out in a few weeks, is that the modalities along each student's learning path have to be connected. It has to be an integrated experience for it to be blended learning. So that means that if a student's working in small group instruction, what they do there informs what they do when they hop on the online learning and what they do in a project and so forth. You can't have these modalities just be totally disconnected so that what you're doing in online learning has nothing to do with what you might do in small group instruction with a teacher. So essentially the definition boils down to that online learning meets brick and mortar schools. And right now we're seeing school systems from charter schools to district schools and so forth go through this unbelievable transformation where they're starting to move into this new world. And the question for entrepreneurs as you're starting businesses in this transition point right now is where do you target those early products and services that you're building right now? And it feels like there's actually three choices that entrepreneurs actually have right now. The first is actually to sell to educators in the existing system. In the existing system where we have classrooms with teachers at the front, very traditional sorts of environments, and help to solve genuine problems in that system, from lesson planning to classroom management and so forth. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The second option feels like an option to sell to blended learning environments that are actually sustaining innovations relative to the traditional classroom. And I'll talk about what that looks like in a moment as well. And the third option that we're seeing play out is to help solve problems in this new disruptive ecosystem of blended learning models that looks different in many respects from what the system looks like in the other two contexts. And given the pace of change, this actually feels like a real dilemma for a lot of startups getting into the game because a lot of the market is still in that number one point, right? The existing system, the existing classroom that looks a lot like what we're doing right now. There's a whole set of models that are moving to this second sustaining innovation phase of blended learning that presents another choice. And there's very few folks, Ben Rayer I see in the audience at Touchstone, who have truly disruptive models of blended learning. He's at Touchstone Schools in New Jersey, about to change the name. So, but we see a lot of these models now, and for entrepreneurs trying to figure out what problems to solve, this is a genuine difference. And the difference and the question of what you attack actually does matter for some reasons. So what I thought I would do is just step back for a second, tell a story about the disruption of the vacuum tube companies that powered consumer electronics back in the 1950s and 60s. If you went back in that era, literally these products were powered by vacuum tubes which were about the size of your fist, and they'd blow out every once in a while. And along came this company called, along came this technology called transistors that it initially could only power very small products and had limited functionality, but looked like a pretty exciting technology for its durability, for its ability to allow for smaller devices and so forth. And every vacuum tube manufacturer took a license to the transistor and then framed it as a technology problem. Basically, if we invest enough money in perfecting the transistor, we can just plug it into our current systems, our current tabletop radios and floor-standing televisions and so forth, and our customers won't even know the difference. Now, change, though, actually came about from this disruptive angle on this green plane out here, where the first application of the transistor was in a hearing aid in 1952. A hearing aid was perfect for the transistor because a vacuum tube had literally always been impractical for a hearing aid. And transistors were perfect because you had a technology that didn't need a lot of power with transistors that couldn't handle a lot of power. And it was a marriage made in heaven. And a few years later, Sony came out with this thing called a transistor pocket radio. These were crummy devices that they sold to the low end of humanity, non-consumers, people we call teenagers today, who were delighted with this thing because it was way better than their alternative, which was nothing at all. And we saw it get better and better and better. And for those of you who've read Disrupting Class, you know that the next step was portable televisions. And by the late 1960s, basically, the transistor companies like Sony got so good that they blew RCA and Zenith out of the water and transformed the world. But the interesting thing about this was it wasn't just RCA that got disrupted by Sony. What we actually see is that when disruption is afoot, it's often whole systems disrupt systems. And so RCA and Zenith and companies like that, they made their technologies out of the parts of these component suppliers whose economics, their value propositions, their systems were very well honed for what RCA and Zenith was producing. And they sold them through appliance stores. that were made their money by actually repairing the vacuum tubes when they would blow out every once in a while. They didn't make it from actually selling the products themselves. And when disruption came, it was actually a whole new value network of suppliers that transformed the world. And so you had component suppliers unique to Sony's value proposition, selling it through discount retailers that had no service arm and couldn't provide any service, with a product actually that didn't need much service in the aftermarket. So whole systems disrupted systems. And so as entrepreneurs are thinking about where are we going to serve? Are we going to serve the old line classroom that we currently have in place? There's a market there today for sure, and there is need. The question is, 10 years from now, is that landscape still going to be here? And it's an interesting thing to be thinking about. What we're seeing is that the current education system looks a lot like the classrooms did from 100 years ago, which you've heard as a theme here and elsewhere probably too much at this point. But we see a lot of technology constantly coming into these environments that don't actually create blended learning environments. So, for example, just putting a smart board and beaming online curriculum at students isn't fundamentally changing the paradigm and moving it to a blended learning environment where students have control over the time, place, path, or pace of learning. So what we're doing right here, right now, ironically enough, not blended learning. Similarly, just simply equipping the school with digital textbooks or one-to-one laptops doesn't automatically make it a blended learning environment. Substituting for the pencil may be a good idea, but it hasn't returned that power to students and actually shifted the value to a student-centric education system. In fact, a lot of technologies that have come out have been geared towards solving these sort of old problems in the old system. You can tell a story of sustaining innovation where from the chalkboard, we saw the whiteboard, and then we saw the electronic whiteboard or smartboard, and we've had a whole host of technologies from projectors and slide rules and transparency slides and so forth that basically just sustain that model of teacher at the front, students listening as a cohort 30 at a time. And that's one set of markets in which to solve genuine problems right now that teachers have with. There's a second one, which is then this blended learning environment. And you saw I alluded to that there's sustaining innovations of blended learning and there's disruptive innovations of blended learning. And I thought I'd just give another analogy from industry just to sort of help understand why this is. And what the insight is that every single industry we've studied, when there's a disruptive innovation that enters, there's actually a hybrid phase that the industry goes through. And so it's never the case that the leading companies just ignore the disruptive technology. They actually tend to see it, and they integrate it as a hybrid to get the best of both worlds. And this is a very constant phase. So I had that same chart up there that I talked through on the disruption of RCA and Zenith. I want to tell a very different story, this time in the really sexy industry of digging up holes through cable-actuated shovels. For those of you who've never done this before, these shovels actually, you can see, have a forward scooping motion that they would come in, and they were controlled by cables and so forth. And there was a disruptive technology invented, which was hydraulics, which enabled you to do basically a backwards scooping and make far more precise holes when these hydraulic shovels would come in. But initially, they couldn't handle the big loads that these cable-actuated shovels would do, and so they were disruptive technology. They couldn't make big holes, but for people that had small, precise ones to dig, it was a great way to get their start, and they got their start with this little thing called the Bobcat that you can see literally dug the other way about and could only make maybe 2 by 2 holes at a time, could only dig up a little bit of earth. And this hydraulics, you can tell, was a very similar story of disruption of the cable-actuated, where it kept getting better and better and better. But what was interesting was it wasn't simply that they replaced the cable-actuated companies by coming in with this hydraulic in a straightforward way. There was actually this hybrid phase, which was called the hydro-hoe. You can't make up these names. Some people say that education companies don't know how to brand, but so the hydro-hoe was made by this company called Bucyrus Erie. And literally, as you're looking for your name, Ben, this is a good one. So, so Bucyrus Erie was this company that basically made these cable-actuated shovels, and they introduced the Hydro Hoe as a hybrid to basically allow them to take a lot of the benefits of the precision from the hybrid technology with the ability to still use the cable-actuated shovels and so forth to actually be able to carry a lot of the load. And you can actually see the cables and so forth in that diagram were a little bit bigger for you, and yet it's that backward scooping motion taking the advantage of the hydraulics as well. But ultimately what happened was that the disruption got good enough and actually blew out the hybrids in the long term. Now, we see a similar set of choices right now coming through lots of industries, as I said. So you see Tesla coming in with an electronic car right now, threatening to blow out the way we've always done automobiles. But electric engine is actually a classic disruptive innovation if you think about it, because it can't go as far or as fast on a charge as the traditional internal combustion engines. And so the lesson from disruption is that you shouldn't start there, but you should instead start at the low end with simple cars for people that don't want to go fast or don't want to go very far. So the question is, are there customers that would love a car that wouldn't go far or fast? The answer tends to be parents of teenagers or in assisted living communities and so forth, where actually those are great places where you value those sorts of things that the electronic engine brings forward. What's interesting is that there's, of course, a hybrid phase in that that's quite successful, that marries the best of both. We've seen it in photography as well. Actually, when digital cameras got invented, there was the value proposition was first you come to places like CVS or convenience stores, or you use your printer and you actually print out the photos still. The real disruptive innovation in digital photography has been through the smartphone, where we just now share everything on Facebook and so forth. And we're seeing an interesting transition in the blended learning world occur too. These are the models of blended learning that we're seeing across the landscape. It's a somewhat confusing chart, but what I want you to imagine is basically brick and mortar schools meet online learning, and they have a baby that's called blended learning. And then there's a whole bunch of models underneath that. And there's 4 distinct models that we're seeing emerge across the landscape right now. The rotation model, the flex model, the self-blend, or what we're actually going to start calling the a la carte model, and then the enriched virtual model. And what's interesting to us is that the station rotation, lab rotation, and flipped classroom models, all 3 of those actually look very much like sustaining innovations. And the individual rotation there, flex, self-blend, and enriched virtual, actually look much more like disruptive innovations. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment. If you look at the station rotation model, basically what's happening is that within a given classroom, students are rotating among different activities, one of which is online learning. And basically what you've done is preserve the classroom and married it with the new technology, a perfect hybrid, right? Where you have the old technology, the classroom, and married it with the new. And you can actually see it in the examples. This will click forward. That you literally, this is at KIPP Empower, which has a station rotation. You have a classroom, which is the old technology, and you combine it with the online learning to produce a sustaining innovation blended learning model. Similarly, the lab rotation looks very similar. You keep the conventional classroom, and you have students rotating out to a lab to do their online learning, where you're marrying the best of both worlds. Students get the traditional classroom plus the online learning. And same thing in the flipped classroom model as well, where you're keeping the conventional classroom and students are doing the learning online at home. All of these look like classic sustaining innovations on top of the old classroom. But the real disruption of the classroom as we know it is not a disruption of schools, because those are going to be, in my prediction, the majority is going to be in blended learning schools, but we're seeing that disruption of that old classroom. And so some of these other models that look more disruptive have actually been planting themselves when they first got their start in these classic areas of non-consumption, where that alternative is literally nothing at all, just like the other examples from other industries that we started. So just like the first hydraulic shovels basically would dig small holes for people that couldn't afford those big cable-actuated shovels, we're seeing a lot of non-consumption at the level of classes, which is where online learning in these blended learning environments are getting their start, from credit recovery to serving dropouts to advanced courses and on and on and on. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the budget cuts and teacher shortages are actually enlarging these areas of non-consumption, which is creating more rooms for these disruptive blended learning models to emerge. And so one is the individual rotation model. As you can see from this doesn't look like a classroom at all. It's a huge learning plaza or learning environment in which students are learning online through the online learning technology. And then around the perimeter of the big room, they're moving out on individual playlists where they're getting small group instruction, doing projects, whatever it might be. But it doesn't look anything like a classroom at all. This is actually an example of Carpe Diem, which is a charter school now in Arizona and Indianapolis. And you can see they've literally blown out and don't have that old technology of the classroom there anymore. And teachers are literally working one-on-one with students at their offices and so forth. Similarly, the flex model is very similar to that, where they've thrown out the notion of the old classroom as we've known it and created this wide open learning environment in which students are learning online and every child has an individual playlist that they're effectively moving fluidly and flexibly through. The a la carte model is quite literally maybe the purest disruption because it's a teacher that's virtual from the students. But what we're seeing is that a lot of schools are creating cyber cafes and places for students to learn online and take these courses that they wouldn't otherwise be able to offer and actually create these pretty robust blended experiences as well with other students. And the enriched virtual model is much the same. It looks very similar to a full-time virtual school where they're just adding a brick and mortar component where students can come in and get a lot of face-to-face support each week and so forth. And so essentially, what happens is when we see disrupted classrooms that moves beyond that notion of the old classroom, they're bringing new value propositions that are different from that traditional classroom and that hybrid blended learning that we're seeing. The hybrid blended learning keeps a lot of order. It's a lot safer. It's a lot more predictable. It's built generally around seat time and notions of that, whereas the new disruptive models are much more fit for a competency-based learning environment in which students move at their path and pace very fluidly. And there's a bit of a risk, as several of us have been discussing over the last few weeks, which is it feels more chaotic sometimes. Students have much more control, and the teacher has less control in sort of one sense, but in another sense is actually able to work much more individually with students. But there is a degree of unpredictability right now because it's such an early disruptive technology. And so we're seeing that these these value propositions that this new model brings are much more toward individualization, productivity gains in some cases, and greater access and equity to be able to offer any child in any geography access to any course or teacher that's highly qualified and highly effective no matter where they live. But it's a very different set of value propositions. And as entrepreneurs are thinking through that, it's a genuine decision because my sense of it anyway is that in a lot of the elementary schools we're seeing right now, we're not actually seeing this disruptive model of education unfold. And my sense is that a lot of this is going to be the sustaining innovation blended learning where we actually have a lot of station rotation classrooms and so forth. And so that may be one set. But as we push up into middle and high school, it seems the potential to break out of this classroom as we know it and go much more toward these disruptive models, my sense is that it'll really be in the individual rotation and flex environments, is much more robust. And for entrepreneurs thinking about which set of problems to solve, talking to someone who's working in these disruptive models versus one who's working in the traditional classroom versus one which is working in the hybrid sustaining innovation models of blended learning are very different problems and very different needs for the products and services that they need for market. And so as entrepreneurs crafting these sorts of things, my sense is that being very intentional about what market you're serving and what market you're solving problems for, and who are the teachers and educators you're solving them for, is a really important thing to be thinking through right now at the state of transition over the next decade. So that's what I wanted to leave us with some thoughts with, and I think we've got about 5 minutes for Q&A. So thank you very much. So there's a microphone there, so just go ahead and fire away with any bullets and so forth or questions that you want to have asked? Otherwise, I can get off. None? Come on. Here we go. Grab a mic just so it gets captured on video, I think.
Yeah, I would like to know a little more about how the Clayton Christian Institute operates. Do you guys work with major corporations, entrepreneurs? How do you guys work, et cetera?
Sure thing. So the Clayton Christensen Institute, which was Insight Institute before we're in the middle of changing our name right now. We operate as a nonprofit think tank, very similar to a lot of the Washington-style think tanks in DC, where we do a few functions. We do research about how these theories suggest that changes are going to come about. We do a lot of profiling of what the blended learning models of the future are going to be looking like, and trying to do a lot of research around that area to inform the field itself. We do a lot of work with policymakers, where we're going around the country testifying, talking about these changes, and what are the policy implications and so forth. And then the final role that we play in the field is connecting innovators to each other. So my colleague Meg Evans is in the audience here. She's our program associate, where she literally runs about 24 blended learning schools, helps convene them so that they can have conversations with each other about what sorts of products and services are and are not working and so forth. Or alternatively, we talk with a lot of entrepreneurs and funders and try to help connect people to others that can help make the breakthrough progress that they need to really be successful in transforming the system to a student-centric one. That, at the end of the day, is what our mission is to make sure it's a student-centric one. And so we're not always interested in disruption for disruption's sake, or certainly technology for technology's sake. Yeah.
I have the microphone though.
Okay, we got it. Yeah.
Michael, so I had a question about how do entrepreneurs or companies in some of those other industries you talked about create a sustainable business when the market you're going after in a disruptive environment is just not big enough maybe to attract your attention or attention of investors?
Yeah, I think this is actually the hardest thing that I'm still puzzling over, Ben, which is, so first of all, when investors look at these spaces or people that would-be entrepreneurs look at disruptive markets, because they always target non-consumption where there's literally nothing, there is no market size. And so as you look at marketing, as you look at market reports or whatever else to try to justify investment, there's almost nothing there by definition, which makes it really hard to make this leap of faith. And oftentimes, that's why you see very integrated systems emerge in the first examples of disruption. And we heard this a little bit on the panel Jeff was talking about in the corporate market, that there's a lot of modular point solutions at first tried, and then you had to actually standardize around some pretty integrated solutions in the beginning. And I sort of feel like that's where we are right now, where what you see is that people trying school designs or so forth are starting to realize that the market isn't there yet because it's not big enough to justify investments, and are actually, like Summit Public Schools is, having to integrate backwards and create some of the platforms and tools that they need themselves because there's no one else doing it around them. And my sense is that a few integrated providers, as a result, are likely to be our first wave that really solves some of these problems we're wrestling with right now, which is what we've typically seen in other markets. And then as we start to understand the interfaces and the market just grows a lot bigger, people will start to demand much more customization and speed to market as opposed to just reliability and make sure it works. And then we'll start to see a shift to the modularity and a lot more investment once again coming in, fueling that second half. But it feels to me like we're still not quite ready to jump ahead into that, and so that's part of the struggle. The second thing I would say, Clay Christensen's been talking a lot about why he worries that venture capital firms are going to be disrupted, and why a lot of the reasons that our economy has struggled to create jobs is that the way we measure financial success and so forth disposes us to invest in sustaining innovation products as opposed to truly disruptive ones that create new markets. And I worry a little bit that education is actually that brought to the extreme, that we need very patient capital that's not looking for a return in 3 to 5 years, but is really thinking 8, 10 years down the road, and might not have the same sort of liquidity events that you see in other markets. So, yep.
I recognize it's still pretty early, but are there any directional initial studies or research you've seen that connect efficacy to the different models? And second question on that is,
Yeah.
after you answer that, why does it even matter in this largely irrational market?
Let me do my best. And hopefully I understand the second question as well. So on the first one, my sense of it actually is that these models are not going to correlate well with success, with good or bad. And so that you see some excellent flex models in action, and you can also go into some dropout recovery centers right now and see some terrible flex models. And so my sense is that they're not going to correlate well to good or bad. And there are studies, the Dell Foundation has done some very interesting studies looking at the individual models, but you don't see that sort of predictable thing based on the models itself. It seems to me how you execute, how you actually empower the teacher differently and help to shape that new role. I think human capital is something that we're going to have to think a lot about in these new models in very different ways. Those to me feel like the things that are going to be much more predictive of success in the long run. The second question is why does it matter? So for commercial success today, I'm not sure it does matter because the market of public education does not in fact value above all else student learning growth and student outcomes. It's still a very input-based system. And one of my worries personally is that from a policy perspective, and Jim Shelton talked about this yesterday, is starting to move the market toward a competency-based learning environment that values student learning growth and rewards people based on that rather than the inputs and what it looks like, is something that's really important. And as we're in this disruptive shift right now, I worry that the access is outpacing those new models that reward based on actual efficacy and so forth. And that's something from a policy conversation and the demand side of schools and so forth, we have to do a much better job of shaping and getting out ahead of right now. So last question, yeah.
So you talked about human capital. How much is all this being constrained by the physical plant, the buildings and all of that real expensive capital? And how will that school of the future be changed and reconfigured and have to look in order to make this work? Or can we do this with the existing physical plant?
You asked the $64 million question, and it's the one literally in our paper that we get stuck on, which is that the physical plant, it feels like, is a huge install base that traps us a lot in these models. And so our sense is that in banking, for example, where you've seen a hybrid of online banking combined with ATMs, but it hasn't put out branch banking because you still have paper currency for which branch banks are still pretty useful, and there's a huge install base there. Schools are sort of in a similar analogy where that install base of schools and the egg crate classroom design actually locks us down in many respects, and I think could make this transition to the truly disruptive models be a lot longer than some people might otherwise expect. I think thinking through the architectural and what are the right new building designs and so forth is something really interesting to think about. I think we're getting some clues from places like what Ben is doing in New Jersey. It looks radically different. It's a very cool design when you walk in, from what Summit Public Schools is doing, from what Milpitas Public Schools in California is doing. We're starting to see some new designs that I think really start to break our idea of what this has to be. And my sense is it'll be much more open learning spaces that value student work and are actually smaller facilities in many cases that are less expensive than the current buildings we have, which begs another question of how do you disrupt the architect contractor relationship with the districts that I haven't put my head around right now. But I think it's the right question at the moment in time. So thank you so much, guys, for your time. Appreciate it.